Swedish prisons came into the spotlight in the summer of 2019 when rapper A$AP Rocky was incarcerated after assaulting two people in Stockholm. He claimed that he was served inedible food, had to drink dirty water, and that the Swedish jail conditions were horrible in general. Let's dive into the history of crime and punishment in Sweden, and let's explore prisons in particular. This is the prison museum in Gävle, a town just north of Stockholm. There are two different prisons to explore here. Let's start with the oldest one, the castle jail from 1732. Back in 1732, Swedes were into a lot of humiliation and corporal punishments. I guess some people are still into that, but remember, we're talking about crime and punishment now. Prisoners were kept in jails while awaiting their judgment, and there were no individual cells back then. After judgment, they would be put in pillories so passers-by could spit on them or throw rocks, or they would be put in workhouses, or they would be executed. Before this jail was built in 1732, there was another dungeon here built in 1553. And, well, let's just say that the conditions weren't great. I think A$AP Rocky would have had a little bit more to complain about if he had been put here. So what other types of punishment were dished out back in the olden days? Well, people were burnt at the stake, for example. This was a strict punishment, not just for witches, but for female criminals in general. And actually for males as well, who had done indecent things to animals. This practice was removed from official punishments as late as 1841. But just so you don't believe that Swedes were complete barbarians, there's just been one case of a person being burnt at the stake alive. In other cases, they had their throats cut first. Another way to get executed was to be beheaded. Common people, they got the headsman's axe, but a noble person could get a sword instead, and they could be buried in hallowed ground. I'm sure that made them really happy. But if your crime was lesser, like owing someone money for example, you would be placed in jail until you could cough up the cash. Basically, you would be placed there indefinitely until you somehow could produce the money. Oh, and if someone had to pay a fine, they could be sentenced to run a gauntlet instead. That sounds pretty good, doesn't it? Not have to pay any money, just get a beating instead, right? Wrong. Up to 150 soldiers would be lined up with sticks and ordered to beat the runner as hard as they could. Most people running a gauntlet died, but as of 1734, that practice was abolished. A prison reform took place in Sweden in the 1800s. Instead of focusing on shame and pain, prison cells were built instead. This is a cell-based prison, and the main idea was that keeping people in isolation would be much more intimidating than previous types of punishments. In the 1800s, prisoners were kept in complete silence and isolation up to 2 years, and people actually thought that that would bring an end to all crime. Yeah, I don't really think that worked out so well. This prison was nicknamed Hotel Hamilton until it was closed down in 1986. Now it's open as a museum for people to visit and be horrified by. Oh, lovely. A hug yourself sweater. Sweden continued to reform the judicial system. Hanging was abolished in the 1800s, and capital punishment in general was abolished in 1921. In modern times, the Swedish prison system has moved from punishment to rehabilitation instead. And that's where we get back to the rapper who was put in jail in Stockholm. He was put in a modern jail, not a jail from the 1700s. Modern cells are boring but functional and clean. Better than my first student apartment. He was fed better food than our school children get for lunch, and he was given extremely pure and clean tap water. So A$AP Rocky was of course just talking crap. He was simply treated just like anyone else who commits a crime in Sweden. He wasn't mistreated in particular, because Sweden believes in rehabilitating prisoners and not punishing them. Or at least that's what they say. Sweden is a pretty good place, but it's not above critique. The main idea is that prisoners should be rehabilitated and be made into productive members of society again. But that's not always shared by individuals working in the justice system or in the police. Some still believe that criminals must be punished. And speaking of jails, Sweden may not have the worst jails ever, but people can still be kept excessively long in jail, awaiting their judgment. And Amnesty International has criticized Sweden for the large number of suicides that happen in jail, and that it's very hard to investigate complaints against the police. There have been many cases, both recently and throughout the decades, of extreme police brutality that never led to any reprimands or consequences at all for the police. The Swedish prison system used to be quite harsh. It has been reformed a lot in modern times, but it's still not perfect. I'd prefer a Swedish jail instead of, for example, an American jail, but if it's all the same, I'd rather skip it altogether, thank you very much. While I keep myself honest, you like and subscribe, but most importantly, have a great day.